meet each other and are partaking of the food as well. We'll get started now, but please feel entirely free to stand up at any point and go help yourself to the food and whatever else you need to do with dessert and so on. My name is Bill Cavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul. And if I haven't met you yet, please do, if you get a chance, introduce yourself. And also, if you'd like to be on our mailing list for future events, please, Karen Francis, do we have, we've got a sheet going around, so if you're not already on our mailing list, please do sign up. We've got all kinds of interesting events like this one happening throughout the year. We had a great conference on Pope Francis in February. We have World Catholicism Week every April, and all sorts of other events during the course of the year. So, and you're always welcome. Today we have a wonderful treat. Our colleague Karen Scott from the History and Catholic Studies departments is here with us. Karen has been at DePaul how many years ago?
25.
25, so she came here when she was 12? It was wonderful to have Karen here to present some of her research. Her specialty is on Renaissance Italy?
Late medieval and Renaissance.
Late medieval and Renaissance Italy, and Catherine of Siena is, she's a close personal friend of Catherine of Siena. Knows her very well. So, I don't know how much more introduction you need. You have the sheet in front of you which explains all of Karen's various accomplishments and publications there if you're interested in following up with that. But without much further ado, then please join me in welcoming Karen Scott. So Karen will talk for 30-40 minutes or something like that, and then we'll have time for conversations.
Thank you all for coming. And part of what I'm going to talk to you about today is work that I've done for all the time I've been at DePaul. But also work that I've done most recently. I was on sabbatical for a year and came back to teaching in January. And so this is really new, hot off the presses kind of research that I'm still in the middle of working on and figuring out. And I'll be very, very happy to have a discussion about it with you when we're done with the little talk. So the title that I gave for the talk is Catherine of Siena, Preaching and the Bible, How Ordinary Catholics Connected with Scripture in the Middle Ages. And I'm coming to this as a professor and a scholar who's interested both in Catholic studies and in history by training I'm a historian. So if you would turn over the sheet, on the back side you will find a little quotation that gives us a kind of context, a broader than historical context for the project I'm working on. And that is the Scripture Bible issue within Catholicism. As you know, many Catholics today would tell you that they don't know the Bible very well, and they would blame it on the church telling them that lay people should not read the Bible. And then they would tell you that, yes, things have changed with the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. There were new statements that came out from Rome that not only authorized lay people's reading the Bible, but encouraged it. And one example of this way of looking at the connection between Catholicism and the Bible is this quotation that from the magazine, the Jesuit magazine called America, from this past January. A renowned Old Testament scholar, wrote this little piece, and this is describing her view of the changes that have happened in the last 50 years in how Catholics look at the Bible. So an evolution has taken place in the Roman Catholic Church's understanding of the Bible. As a result, the life and mission of the Church have been transformed. Biblical stories and themes, formerly unknown, have become familiar. But this is a relatively recent phenomenon. While the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century championed biblically based preaching and teaching through the doctrine of Lutheran Calvinist doctrine of sola scriptura, scripture alone, the Roman Church focused on traditional doctrine and insisted that its leaders alone were authorized to interpret the Bible. It was not until Pius XII's encyclical Divina Afflante Spiritu that a dramatic change in church teaching on the Bible was launched. Considered the Magna Carta of the biblical movement, this document inaugurated a new era in the Catholic life. And then Vatican II builds on that, and here we are today with this program that the editors of America are announcing in sync with the American Bible Society. And of course what Diane wrote here is true. And you will hear many, many people my age or older basically say, yes, this was the situation. But the problem with this is that it implies that until the 16th century, Catholics knew nothing of the Bible. And that is very, very problematic. From my perspective as a historian, I simply know that is not the case. And the question, though, and this is where I come into this as a historian, it's to understand how the Bible was known, what parts of it were emphasized, how it was interpreted, and in particular, how ordinary people, like all of us here, in the Middle Ages, might have encountered the Bible. Now, it so happens that we have relatively few historical sources to understand that question. The study of the Bible in the Middle Ages usually happens from the top down. That is, we look at biblical manuscripts, we look at books that were made to help preachers so they would know biblical references. You look at preaching as it happened, as it was done by intellectual type preachers or popular preachers. But very rarely do we have any information or have scholars been able to study how the lay people in the churches received what they heard and what the Bible meant to them. And it so happens that Catherine of Siena offers us a wonderful opportunity to study this. And so that is where my research comes in as an attempt to get at ordinary people's connection with Scripture. In Catherine of Siena's case, it's the 14th century, and the place is Italy. So at the top, if you turn your page over, at the top I have a number of little quotes that are going to give you a foretaste of where I'm going with my article. I'm going to argue that lay people knew the Bible quite well in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Italy. But they tended to know it through short quotations that were pithy, memorable, and that they could use and reuse many times. And I want to draw a parallel between late medieval knowledge of the Bible and what we see today on Facebook, on Twitter, in popular preaching today as well. So, you know, I looked at Facebook this morning, and one of the first things that came up was "Bring back our girls." Hashtag, bring Bring Back Our Girls. You know what that refers to. This shout out to protect the girls who were abducted so that they will be liberated. And the more people shout this out, say this, the better. And it's spread through the internet, and it's a memorable, simple phrase that everyone understands. And it's simple, and has that advantage of being memorable, and it has spread like wildfire through the internet just in the last few days. A few weeks ago, we celebrated the feast day of Catherine of Siena on April 29th, and I was also very curious to see what was going to pop up on Facebook. And a number of different sites that I follow had little wonderful little snippets that they put up as embodying for them the main contributions of Catherine of Siena's teaching. And so here are some good ones. Preach the truth as if you had a million voices. It is silence that kills the world. I think the Bring Back Our Girls folks will agree with that. Actually, this is what came up on Facebook. The original, in the original, Catherine says, preach the truth with 100 million voices, or even more. Shout out, speak out, don't be silent when something is seriously wrong in the world. And then a couple more. To the servant of God, every place is the right place, and every time is the right time. All the way to heaven is heaven. Be who God meant you to be, and you will set the world on fire. And you can see why these little quotations would have captured some people's imagination, and they would be remembered. You might, as you heard me say them, have been attracted to one or the other of these. I'm just wondering, if you were to not look at this page now, is there any one of these that you remember that you could repeat? Yeah.
The one that preaches if you have a million voices. That one I even cut out a little sticker and put it in one of my diary books.
Ah, you know that one. Okay. Yeah, it's good. These are memorable. But what's the problem with envisioning an author through a short Facebook quotation or a Twitter quotation that has to be limited to how many characters on Twitter? You know, very few. What the problem is that these quotations, which are lovely, are out of context. So we don't know really what Catherine was writing about when she said these words, to whom she addressed them, what historical events were occurring at this time that would have occasioned her to say these words. And so they're memorable, they're short, they're wonderful, but they're limited too. And yet, what I want to argue is that this kind of short, to-the-point, pithy saying is part of what makes popular religion work. It's part of what made the Bible work in the Middle Ages. This kind of short saying. And as an example of that, I put here quotations from Pope Francis and from the New Testament that are memorable, short, pithy, and very, very effective. I wouldn't want to say it's exactly like advertising slogans, but there is some commonality between the advertising slogan and this kind of short saying. So, how many of you have heard the story about Pope Francis? May God forgive you for what you have done, said right after the cardinals elected him. Who am I to judge? That one everyone has heard. I heard another one, actually, right after Francis was elected, which is that when he was about to come out on the balcony to be announced as the new pope. He was waiting in the room right behind the balcony, and they were going to give him all the fancy vestments to put on. And he looked at them and said, oh, no, thank you. Carnival is over. Now, carnival is over. 3 words. I remember that. It sends a wonderful message. But you do need to know a little bit of the context to understand. But these are, he seems to be very effective at word bites that people respond to. So that his daily preaching in the Vatican is all over the internet. If you are following this, you can know, and people do pay attention quite a bit. Of course, we know that the New Testament started out as a lay preacher named Jesus who walked around Judea and Galilee and spoke words that were memorable, that were remembered by his followers. And through a process of oral tradition and finally literary composition, got put into the New Testament. So that some of the most famous sayings of Jesus in the Bible are things that are indeed short and memorable. And perhaps some of the people in his audience remembered the statement slightly differently, so you will find some differences between among the 4 canonical Gospels, and not to mention other Gospels. But, you know, forgive your enemies, my God, why have you abandoned me? Peace be with you. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. And you could think of many other statements like that. So what we have to think of is the Bible as a collection, certainly many of the stories in the New Testament as short, pithy sayings that Jesus' disciples remembered, that got eventually put into a literate text, which was then preached orally and mostly heard by illiterate people in church or through preaching. And remembered, we can imagine, the ordinary people then remembering these same short sayings, in some ways in the same way in which they had been originally proposed. So this is the big kind of picture I am offering as a way to understand then what would have happened to ordinary lay people in 14th century Italy. And I come to this after having studied Catherine of Siena's many writings and noticing that the form in which the Bible comes is always these short little quotations. And so now I would like to shift and tell you a tiny little bit about her. Who is this person? What did she accomplish? What do we know about her? And then to give you some examples of her scriptural knowledge and interpretation. So her dates are 1347 to 1380. She came from a family of dyers, not poor, but not rich either. So a family of artisans. She was almost certainly uneducated, and as a young woman, she was very pious, and she had visions. And as we know from her main biographer, Raymond of Capua, in a text called The Greater Legend, Legenda Maior, she withdrew from sort of ordinary activity as a woman and spent 3 years in her room at home in deep prayer. And then received a call from God to move out of her room into the world. And he tells the story of Catherine of Siena very much through a series of visions and deep encounters with God, mystical experiences. and then through a description of her main virtues. And he ends the book with a long recap of her life in relation to the virtue of patience. And she comes across as someone who fasted a great deal, so much so that some modern historians have seen in her a case of similar in some ways to anorexia nervosa. She fasted a great deal. She was a mystic, and this Raymond of Capua tends to de-emphasize the aspects of Catherine's life that might interest us the most today, which is that she was very much actively involved after she comes out of her room in peacemaking, in church reform, and what I call informal preaching. So she wanted to be heard on a whole slew of issues. Here we have an ordinary laywoman. She was connected with the Dominican order, but was not a nun in a monastery. She lived at home or lived in the homes of friends, never took formal vows. So she's a laywoman. She got involved in a number of major problems that were facing her world. And in particular, in the 1370s, there was a big push to have the popes return from living in Avignon in what is now southern France to move back to Rome. And there was a war going on between a league of Tuscan cities, including Florence, Siena, Pisa, all those places we go to on vacation in Italy. A league of these Italian cities against the papacy. And all of these cities had been excommunicated, which meant there could not be mass, there could not be burials or baptisms in Tuscany at the time Catherine was most active. So there were also serious issues that Catherine wanted to address in the form of church reform. Bishops that were not present in their dioceses, that were involved in life at the court, all the forms of money, corruption that you can imagine, some of that was going on at this time as well. And then at the very end of her life, Catherine succeeds in going to Avignon, talks to Pope Gregory XI, has something to do with persuading him to return the seat of the papacy to Rome. She comes back to Italy. Gregory dies. A new pope is elected, Urban VI, who was not a nice man. And he made lots of enemies. And so there was a schism. That is a formal separation between the church that supported the Roman Pope and the church that supported another pope, an anti-pope, who resided in Avignon. And right at the end of Catherine's life, she's very, very concerned about church unity. And so she was very much aware of the major problems of her day, and she set out to address them, which is amazing. So Raymond of Capua in the Legenda, he alludes to these things. But for example, the only thing he says about her trip to Avignon is through her persuasion, the Pope returned to Avignon. In Latin it's 2 words. He doesn't. He tells some stories about her visiting the Pope in Avignon, and he translated for her because she only spoke Italian, and the Pope spoke French, and so Raymond was there, and he translated using Latin. But basically, he says very little about her active involvement in these issues. But if we look at Catherine's own writings, we find much evidence there for her involvement in these issues, pressing issues of her day. And she dictated what we have now is 383 letters, but there were far more than that because she alludes to letters that have disappeared. So it's 6 volumes of letters in the modern edition. In a period of just 6 years, she sent all of these letters. And she sent them to popes, kings, city governments, bishops, cardinals, everybody who had any influence. And then she sent letters to her close friends in Siena, and Florence, and Pisa, and Lucca, and letters to people she'd never met before, but who she'd heard of, and they were in need of some kind of spiritual encouragement or instruction, and so she sent them letters too. And then a couple of years before she died, she dictated a major theological and spiritual treatise that she just called My Book, but it's now called The Dialogue of Divine Providence, and we have 26 prayers. So we have a very large corpus of texts as historians that we can look at. And one of the main issues that interests me is that she was not educated and she was illiterate. So these letters were dictated. Her dialogue was dictated. She had a group of friends. Some of them were other lay women like herself. Others of them were priests who took down her dictation. And but this is slightly controversial, what I'm just saying. A recent book has come out by an Italian literature specialist named Jane Tylis, arguing that Catherine was literate, that she could read Italian, and that by the end of her life, she could also write. And I am not so convinced that that is correct, for a lot of reasons. But basically, the sources for her literacy are one story in the Legenda Mayor, that Catherine wanted to learn to read so as to pray the Psalms. And she tried, and she tried, and she tried, and she could not learn to read. And finally, a miracle happened, and she found herself suddenly able to read the Psalms. That to me does not sound really like what we would call today 100% literacy. She may have been able to connect some words on the page with what she had heard of the Psalms as they were prayed by the clergy that she knew. But other scholars of Catherine would agree with me that the oral Catherine is far more, not only interesting but likely. And in particular, as I mentioned here, Giuliana Cavallini and Suzanne Nofke are two scholars, women scholars, also Italian scholars, Giuliana Cavallini, an American scholar, Suzanne Nofke, who have argued that the oral Catherine is far more likely. And I tend to agree with them. In any case, where I'm coming from is I am interested in Catherine's understanding of herself and how she was able to become such an influential figure in the world of high-level ecclesiastical affairs and peacemaking in her own day, when she came from such a modest background, and indeed, no one would disagree with the fact that she was uneducated. That is pretty much, there's a lot of agreement on that. Certainly, only men went to university in the 14th century, and women, the schools that women could attend. She was not educated in any kind of formal fashion. But let me give you one example of an autobiographical statement that Catherine makes, where she makes it clear that she feels called to be a kind of lay preacher. And it's on the sheet right above what I was just talking about. So the vision of her calling as an informal lay preacher. She's having a vision that she describes in a letter, in which she is expressing enormous concern over the war that has been called the War of the Eight Saints. It's the war between the Tuscan cities and the papacy. This does not fit her idea of how things are supposed to be. There should be peace. That is what the will of God is. And all these people are Christians, and peace is necessary. So she's in a prayer situation asking God, but why? Why is there this war? And it's very difficult to manage the papacy against the cities where she lives. So she has a kind of conversation with God about this, and Christ tells her, well, you have to understand this is sort of like when I threw the money changers out of the temple, and I had to come in and give them a hard time with my discipline. With the whip, I threw them out of the temple because they were ruining things. And likewise, right now, the church has people in it that are like these merchants, basically, and I am sending my discipline upon them. That is the war that is occurring, so that the church will be purified and reformed. So it is sinful that these cities are at war with the Pope. It's a bad thing, but it is going to have a positive effect. So understand that there's a bigger picture here. And then she describes a vision in which there is a throng of human beings, sort of all of humanity, and they are marching together into the heart of Christ. And there's if you imagine late medieval art representing Jesus on the cross with his wounds, and the wound in the side goes into the heart, and it's like she imagines it as a big, wide space. The heart of Christ is this big, wide space. So in the vision, she and all of humanity, she says the believers and the unbelievers, the fedeli e gli infedeli, together walk into the heart of Christ. And she joins them. She goes in with them. And when she arrives at the center of God's heart, of God's love, she then has this little vision that I quoted here. She hears God say to her, "Go to the believers and the unbelievers and tell them, I announce to you a great joy." Now this is just a few words, but if we unpack what this line is, she is being called from within the heart of God, who loves all of humanity, to be God's instrument in going out from her little comfortable zone into an area that is not a comfort zone, go to the believers and the unbelievers, and talk to them, announce to them a great joy. And the great joy is the joy of the gospel, of salvation. And right before Jesus says this to her, he gives her the cross in her hand and puts it on her shoulder, and then the olive branch. And so the content of her preaching is going to be the olive branch piece and the cross of salvation. And this is one of the niftiest self-descriptions that she gives of herself. So actually, right after she had this vision, she set off to Avignon. Just a few days later. This, I think, reinforced her in her sense that what she felt called to do was good, and that she should go out and preach to the Pope and to the secular leaders of her day. Now, I put the words, "I announce to you a great joy," in italics here. I'm sorry, in bold, because it is a biblical quotation. Does anybody recognize where this line comes? Yeah?
Isn't it the Annunciation?
Nope. Not too long after the Annunciation, like 9 months later.
The angels, the shepherd.
So it's the angels at the nativity of Jesus, and the angels say this to whom?
The
The
shepherd.
shepherds. So it's a lovely little vignette of Catherine as a kind of angel of peace being sent to the shepherds of her church to announce to them a great joy, which is that there is meaning in terrible events, and they need to clean up their act, reform the church. The Pope needs to get his tail back to Rome. Literally, she says, "Get your foot out the door." She has a very kind of vernacular way of expressing herself, and he doesn't. I mean, it's her biggest claim to fame. She goes to Avignon and sort of impelled by this mission and speaks to the shepherds, and they follow her lead. Amazing. So this is just one example of her biblical knowledge that she seems to have obviously known about this quotation before she has the vision. And then in the mystical prayer experience that she has, this word comes back to her as Christ's word to her, impelling her in her mission. And notice it's very short, it's to the point, and in her case it really reflects her understanding of herself and the message, the content of the message she wants to send, which is joy. She's actually not depressing for the most part. She can be tiresome, as Bill Kavanaugh mentioned. We're very good friends, and I've spent many hours in her company, and sometimes like, be joyful. Okay, I've heard that. She can get tiresome a bit at times because she repeats her message tirelessly, but it's effective, it's memorable, and it works. She gets things done through this method. So the research I've been doing is a kind of systematic investigation of all of Catherine's biblical references. And it has turned out to be quite a bit more complex job than I thought it would be, because there's a whole lot more biblical stuff there than I had expected. You can look at various editions of Catherine's letters or dialogo, and find some references in the notes. And I spent some time comparing different editions and finding different things in different editions and contradictory references. And okay, I have to start over and do this systematically. And so I have tried to do that. And I'm still in the process of analyzing what I discovered. But as I have here on the sheet, there are at least 200 explicit citations, that is different biblical lines that she brings up multiple times throughout her corpus of writings. 23 of them are from the Old Testament. You see that's very few, relatively speaking. 63 from Acts and the New Testament epistles, especially Paul. And the vast majority of her quotations are from the Gospels, 114 lines, 58 from the Synoptic Gospels, plus 18 from Luke only, 36 from John only, and then she had a few that are not found anywhere in the Bible, but she thought Jesus said them, so I'm counting them too. But that's only 2. That's pretty good. How many of us would try to quote the Bible and always be right if we're doing it from memory? It's pretty good. And the other thing that's quite remarkable is that she's almost always right in distinguishing between something that Jesus said and something that Paul said. I've only found one instance where it seems to be wrong. But she knew the difference. Now, what does she not know? Well, by modern standards, she doesn't give very complete citations. She doesn't tell us the name of the biblical book that the snippet comes from. She does not remember its context, in other words. She doesn't know the difference between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. She never mentions these evangelists except for John. She knows John's name, but she never cites the other evangelists. She does not cite the books of the Old Testament besides the Psalms. She knows the name Psalms, the Psalter. And she knows the book of the Apocalypse. She mentions the book of Revelation one time. However, it's not linked to an actual quotation from the book of Revelation, although she does quote from the book of Revelation several times. She never indicates that she's aware. So how does she indicate that she is quoting the Bible? She imitates the citation format that was found in medieval sermons. And part of my project is to look at about 10 different 14th century Italian writers, sermons, religious writers, letter writers in Italian who quoted the Bible, and to look at each one of these 200 lines, find the Italian version of them that those other writers used, and then compare and contrast their interpretations. So I'm looking at Dominican preachers like Giordano da Pisa or Cavalca. I'm looking at Sienese letter writers like Giovanni Colombini, who predated Catherine by a short generation. I'm looking at the letters of Giovanni da Lecelle, a whole slew of different religious writers, all of them men, not a single woman in the list, and looking at how they quote the Bible, what their emphases are. And what I found is that they too quote the little Bible snippets, short passages. They will say, as Jesus said in Matthew's Gospel, da 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 da. The quotation is in Latin, and then they explain it. Or as the Apostle or Paul wrote, or as the Gospel indicates, and then the little quotation. Catherine introduces her quotations with the same kind of short little phrase, but what she doesn't do is cite the Bible passage in Latin, with just a few exceptions. There are a few Latin quotes, about 20 instances in 2,000 pages worth. Everything is in Italian. And the other thing that she never does is give us a analysis of a long Bible passage. So the literate writers of her day will not only retell a story, but they might do biblical exegesis of the 6 days of creation, one after the other. Or they might do an explanation of this Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, the whole text. line by line. Or the Lord's Prayer, line by line. Or the other preachers might begin their sermon with a short quotation, indeed, and then analyze it word by word. That was the sort of scholastic sermon. Catherine does none of these things. And what's very interesting then is that she has absorbed very little of the technical apparatus, you could say. But what she's paying attention to is the substance of the message. And just to give you some examples, and I'm almost done. You see here at the bottom of this page some examples of her, some of the most commonly quoted examples from the New Testament, from the Gospels. So the first one I love, it's rejoice and be glad. It's quoted 3 times explicitly, but in 34 other letters without any indication that she knows that it's a scriptural text, but she obviously knew it. She just didn't have to say it every time. So reflecting her main message of Christian joy. And not an easy joy. She wrote a lot about joy in the midst of tribulation, which is the original context of the Matthew passage. When you encounter tribulation and persecution, rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in the kingdom of heaven. She knows that context there, but doesn't always refer to it. The second one I have here is Jesus' teaching on love. Love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. There are 7 times she quotes it with an explicit introduction. 45 letters include it without an explicit introduction. But everyone that she was writing to would have known, well, this is from the New Testament. We don't need to say every time, oh, as Jesus said, or Jesus taught. The next 2 quotations are also quite, relatively frequent in Catherine's letters and dialogue. But I've underlined words that show that sometimes she remembered the phrase slightly wrong. And this makes sense if you are hearing a text rather than reading it. Here's my greatest personal example. When I was a child, I loved, one of my favorite Christmas carols was We Three Kings of Glory and Tar. And I heard it that way. And it was only later when I learned to read that no, it's glory of Orient are. 3 Kings of Orient are. We mishear, we don't hear always exactly things the way they're meant to be. And if you're living in an oral culture, as I think Catherine did, you're going to mishear some of the gospel passages. So, the Luke passage, no one who sets a hand to the plow and looks to what was left behind is fit for the kingdom of God. Catherine cites it always and consistently wrong. So it wasn't just one time. The literal translation of the Italian here is no one should turn their head back to look at what has been plowed. Arato is a past participle. The word for plow in Italian is aratro with an R. But she consistently cites it wrong. And she uses this quotation to encourage people to persevere. Keep going, don't turn back. It's a very frequent exhortation in her letters. And the next one, with desire, literally, with desire, I have desired to do this Passover with you before I die. That's a literal translation of the Italian. translated in the modern New American Bible translation, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Actually, this is a quite literal translation of the Latin Bible that Catherine might have heard, or the Italian Bible that she might have heard. She uses this quotation 9 times in an explicit manner that shows that she knows who said it and in what context. It's Jesus at the Last Supper who is saying, I've really been looking forward to dying for you so that I can bring about the salvation of the world. And the time has finally come, and yay, I get to die now. That's a bit of an overstatement, but that is sort of how she interprets it. And what's interesting about this passage is that every single of Catherine's letters begins with a statement, I write to you with the desire to see you, make peace with your enemies or reform the church or whatever. And the 9 times when she explicitly cites it, it's at the beginning of the letters. So she is consciously connecting her own writing of letters with Christ's desire to bring salvation to the world. It's as if God's desire for us meets up with her desire to be in sync with him, and then she writes the letter as an expression of God's desire for universal salvation. Anyway, I could go on and on with these examples. These are just a few. As I mentioned, there are 114 quotations from the Gospel. And they served then, and this is my big point, she used these as building blocks in her letters as she was dictating them to underline the main point she wanted to convey. The most important point she repeats over and over in her letters is that God wishes all human beings to be in union with himself, and it is a union of love. And therefore, the message that she repeats over and over is going to be made clearer by quotations from the Gospel on love. It's what she talks about the most. She has remembered those particular Bible passages that she heard. She also has a lot to say on other things like virtue, the virtue of humility or patience, or who first will be last and the last will be first, or who is exalted is going to be humbled. She uses that with some of the church prelates, or the good shepherd who dies for his sheep. She sends that one to the Pope repeatedly. And then this theme of joy that recurs. So that the messages that she is sending are reflected in the particular choice of gospel passages that she has heard and retained and has now decided to send back to sender, so to speak. The people who had preached to her become her audience, and she exhorts them to live up to the highest standards of love. Now, Catherine is an unusual person. I wouldn't want to argue that every lay person in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance paid as close attention as she did, or would have heard the same things, or remembered all of this. But I think what Catherine of Siena demonstrates to us is that it was possible for lay people to become pretty well educated through attending sermons, perhaps through conversation with more educated people. It was possible. And most significantly, there is no evidence anywhere in Catherine's writings that anyone ever objected to her quoting the Bible, her knowing the Bible in Italian, and her interpreting it in ways that made sense to her. And so, certainly in the late Middle Ages, the Bible was not known in the same way as it was known after the Reformation or today. And yet, it was not, the church did not silence women at all in an overarching kind of way. If someone like Catherine was indeed allowed to preach the gospel with these words in the way that she was. So that's my kind of controversial statement of the day. Yeah.
I was wondering, in 14th century Italy, what was kind of a layperson's Catholic experience? I mean, did they have just weekly mass? Was it a priest that came around into the community once a month? Did they have regular itinerant preachers that just came into town and just would? That would be like, instead of going to movies, we'd go to this, the whole city would go to this talk, you know? So.
Yeah, no, that's right. So you have to imagine lots of little parish churches, many of which have survived. You can go to Tuscan cities and still enter these little parish churches. Some of them were very small. Some churches were very large, especially the churches of the Franciscans and the Dominicans. The preaching friars, they tended to build enormous churches where there was room for large audiences to hear the preaching. There would be mass every day, many times a day. The clergy were supposed to pray the divine office in the church. So to what extent that really happened, that they would pray the Psalms in public every day, several times a day, and the lay people could attend. Certainly in religious orders, that would have happened. So Benedictine monks or Dominican friars would meet at least 5 or 6 times a day to pray together in a way that could be heard by lay people. However, the Sunday Mass and the daily Mass did not include preaching. That is a modern invention. The most important time when lay people would have heard sermons was during Advent and Lent. The Tuscan cities invited itinerant preachers and paid them handsomely to come and preach 3 hours every morning during Lent. And we have some of the sermons that we know of. We know because they were these like Lenten series of sermons. We have what was said every day. Some of these sermons there would be a morning sermon and an evening sermon. We have some of those that have survived in manuscript copies as well. And yes, they were a major form of entertainment. We know this because some preachers complained that lay people were using the sermons as opportunities to meet members of the opposite sex, or it was a form of entertainment as well. But they were very popular. These sermons were well attended, and you have to ask yourself if the cities of 14th century Italy were willing to, or 15th century Italy were willing to spend large sums of money to bring a preacher into town, kind of like a revival, sort of that kind of atmosphere. It must have been because they thought the people in the audience were going to pay attention and learn something and be influenced by it. But we know very, very little, really, about how these sermons were really received and what people truly got out of them. And so that's what I'm trying to understand. Yeah.
I was curious about the Latin quotations that she uses. So the 20 that she uses, are they accurate, and do they jive with the Latin Vulgate Bible? Or?
Okay, so I knew you would come, and I have another handout, which I can give you. There are actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There are exactly 12 Latin lines that she knows. The first one is gustate et videte, taste and see, which Catherine cites twice in Latin, and a bunch of other times in Italian. And the Italian is gustate e vedete. It's identical. I mean, it sounds the same. Then there's gaudete et exultate, which I mentioned before. Or ego sum dia veritas et dia.
So the Italian is shorter than her Italian?
And that is, so they're short, easy to remember, and almost identical to the Italian. So I was wondering, so does she cite these in Latin? Is it the scribe who put them in Latin? Or does she really know the Latin? And, I mean, it's impossible to know for sure. But I was recently looking at about 30 letters that have survived that Catherine's friends and disciples wrote to one another. And these are some of her educated scribes. And they cite the Bible in Latin all the time. They cite it in Latin because they know Latin, they've been to school, they're educated. And yet, when they are serving as her scribes, there are relatively few of these Latin quotations. So I think it's possible that she knew the Latin. It wouldn't have been hard to know that these were Latin phrases. They're almost the same as the Italian, and she would have heard them in Latin. So, another one is consummatum est. That's Jesus on the cross saying, "It is finished." Consummato est, e consummato in Italian, it's almost identical. Io mi confido in Domino nostro Gesù Cristo. It's a mix of Latin and Italian. So, yeah, but it's really interesting that, I mean, for the scholars in the room, it's important to think about the Latin. Yeah.
A little bit longer question than I usually like to ask Karen. Really fascinating, like culture and like Catholicism. So, as you know, I work on women, Reformation, England, Protestant. And you know Joan Kelly's question, did women have a Renaissance? Well, my advisor answered it, no, that they have a Reformation. Right? And that for all of you, what that means is that the Renaissance did not empower women in the same to become writers and thinkers in the same way that the Reformation with its emphasis on sola scriptura and writing and literacy did. And I've recently sort of, even prior to this, begun to rethink this precisely in the dichotomies at the beginning in terms of oral and literate culture. Mm-hmm. And so I guess what I'd like to hear you think about is to sort of think about that question. Do you think women had a Renaissance, or did they have a Reformation, or is the question itself unfairly binary? What do you think in terms of what did the advent of Protestantism and literacy offer women, and what did it take away?
Okay, so first on the Renaissance part of it.
Right.
So Joan Kelly Goodall is a historian who wrote a kind of revolutionary article, indeed entitled, "Did Women Have a Renaissance?" Because before that, scholars had assumed that just as the Renaissance Italy gave men a new sense of individuality and empowerment and the dignity of the human person and interest in education through the revival of antiquity and so on, that women had shared in that same new sense of adventure and new doors opening, etc. And if you look at Italian humanists, you do find that we're talking about the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, that the male humanists have lots of misogynist things to say, and there were very, very few women humanists or women painters, women artists. So what we tend to think of as the great, the Renaissance Ninja Turtles, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Raphael, they're men. And women seem not to have had much of a share in that. And so to that extent, I agree with Joan Kelly that yes, women did not have a Renaissance. However, Catherine of Siena is not a Renaissance figure. She's not educated. And I have thought about this, and I think in her case, her lack of education was actually to her advantage, because she didn't know that she wasn't supposed to be doing this. She had never encountered the learned misogyny that characterized ancient writers or some of the clerical writers, the theologians of her day. And she must have also had access to some very, very encouraging clergy in her own day who thought it was fine for her to be doing what she was doing. And so the learned tradition that is connected with the Renaissance was foreign to her. And this gave her a space to express herself, and also there was such a great need for church reform and peace and church unity and all of this that in some ways people were willing to listen to her. Perhaps in the same way that people were willing to listen to Joan of Arc. Hint, hint, some of my Joan of Arc students are in the room, a few decades later. That when things are really falling apart, this is terrible to say, when things are falling apart, people will listen to women perhaps as a last resort. Think, well, maybe they have some special access to the supernatural. They can help us out. So Joan of Arc is an example of that, and Catherine of Siena is an example of that. In terms of the Reformation, there are literate women in the 16th century who can read the Bible. And they are going to move beyond this kind of short quotation out of context and have a different perspective. In particular, one thing Catherine never does is read Paul's epistles from the point of view of what is the big argument Paul is making. She doesn't know what the big argument. She quotes Paul a lot, but the kinds of theological arguments that Luther will make about salvation by faith alone and not by the works of the law, she never cites that. She doesn't know that. She doesn't know how all these arguments connect. But her Bible is a different Bible, and it's her time's Bible. So yes, things will evolve with literacy and women's ability to study a more complex argument. But at the same time, in the 16th century, women are going to hear Paul say, women should be silent in church, and that will become more of an issue. Catherine doesn't know that. So again, ignorance can be bliss. Maybe one or two more questions, or?
Sure. I was interested in a couple of quotations that were erroneously cited to Jesus. I had all sorts of fun with that. Things that Jesus probably would have said if he thought about it. But could you look at, in looking at those citations, is that kind of like a basic theologizing? Which she knew Jesus, which she understood from the scriptures in her own prayer life, that now she was able to say, Jesus, and it's just like.
Well, let me give you an example. Jesus said, let me know if I'm missing this, if it's somewhere. I am the fire, you are the sparks. It sounds like something Jesus might have said in John's Gospel. I am, all the I am statements. And I'm still looking to figure out where she got that from. No one in any of the editions of that letter, no one can find an attribution. I have discovered a couple of likely reasons why she misquoted some biblical lines by mishearing the Latin and then thinking that certain words in Latin were the same in Italian, and then turning it into her own Italian phrase. And that might be the underlying principle there. But you're right, it also could reflect her own sense of creativity. There's one other thing that I really should point out that's really fun on the handout. The quote about loving the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and blah, 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 your neighbor as yourself. In the Italian, she says, I'm translating the Italian literally, it has been commanded to you that you love me above everything and the neighbor like yourself. No gloss was ever placed on that line. That's what's underlined there. It's the one time she uses a sort of technical term in biblical interpretation. Chiosa here is the same word as gloss, and it means interpretation. Glosses being ways she thinks of watering down a statement. And she says, Jesus taught we are to love every neighbor as ourselves, and we're not going to water that down. And she interprets everything kind of to the maximum degree of radicalness. And that's a kind of form of creativity too, to say that. There are no excuses, no chiosa, no gloss on this. But of course she did interpret things. And I could give other examples of that. In some ways, there are a couple of instances where she interprets a biblical story in an allegorical fashion, which was common in medieval exegesis, where the different people in the story represent different parts of the soul. A couple of places where she does that. Most of the time, though, she interprets the stories very literally without any gloss, and says, you must do this. That's how she approaches the text. Yeah?
Can I just ask two related questions about audience? You made a mention of popular preachers, like popular itinerant preachers. How did Catherine have such an audience, like as these preachers? And how do if not, how do you sort of explain her or give an idea of how she gets this broad appeal? And then the second one was, you made a mention of how in her letters she writes letters to kings and popes and things like that. Would you be able to give us an idea of how she was able to gain access to all of these privileged audience?
Right. Well, she had some powerful friends. Some of the Dominican friars that she knew came from wealthy, noble families. They had been used in diplomatic missions by the Vatican, or by the Pope, first of all in Avignon, and then later the Pope in Rome. And they knew a lot of people, and they kind of gave her like a kind of recommendation that she was legitimate and okay. And they must have also told her about whom to write to. But most of these people she had never met. They had not asked her to communicate with them. She just decided to do it because she felt that this was her call. So most of her audience is individuals that we can know of through these sources. It's individuals she sent letters to. But I see these letters as kind of the tip of the iceberg. That is, she would send a letter to, if the person was far away, living in another city or another country, and she couldn't meet up with them one-on-one. She much preferred to meet with people and discuss things with them in person. And in fact, she famously said that to the Pope a few times. If I were with you, I would really be able to understand what the problem is, and then you would do the right thing. But when she couldn't meet with the Pope, or she couldn't meet with the kings or the rulers, which was most of the time, then she wrote them letters. But I think her appeal had something to do with the quality of the message, the need that people felt for some hope at a time when things looked fairly bleak in terms of war and the need for church reform and the need for church unity and so on. And then perhaps some people introduced her to some of her friends introduced her to other people that she was able to talk to, and sort of widen her circle that way. But it wasn't, I mean, she never gets up in a pulpit in a church and preaches. She's not that kind of a preacher. I call her an informal preacher, though. She was associated as a laywoman with the Dominican order, which is also called the Order of Preachers. And so preaching is central to how she saw herself. And the fact that she was associated with this order would also have given her a kind of legitimacy. But it's a hard question to answer, really. You know, a charismatic personality, I don't know.
You said that her vision that she had, came to her after 3 years of intense prayer.
Yes.
Throughout her life then, did she have long periods of praying, or was it like just a daily mass and just mulling about it as she's washing dishes or cooking, whatever she cooks, or however she ate, or whatever she had to do to be ordinary living as a layperson?
Right. I think there's very little evidence that she ever experienced a dark night of the soul in which she felt she couldn't pray. For her, prayer was talking to God out loud, and she would, they say, go into ecstasy, be insensitive to the world around her, and be talking. And a bunch of these prayers got recorded at the end of her life. People stood next to her as she was praying in this particular way and just wrote down what she said. By then she was famous enough that there were people there writing it down. She's been called the least apophatic of the women mystics of the Middle Ages. That's Bernard McGinn. Apophatic means a kind of mysticism that does not use words. Her mysticism is very concrete, it's very wordy, it's conversational. She has visions, she has some visions, but most of the time her connection with God is not visionary, it's through words, through conversation, through dialogue. And she hears God say things to her in response to her questions. So when they were taking down these prayers, there'll be the section where Catherine's talking, and then it says, and then she was silent. And that means she's listening to God speak to her. And then she speaks again. Whereas in the Dialogo, her book, she recorded through her own dictation both her own words and God's words back to her. So that is the kind of prayer that she seems to have experienced most often. So shall we call it a day? Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and thank think Karen said she's got a few minutes to stick around if people have other questions, but those of us who are on lunch break should probably get back to work. Let me just say a couple other things before you head out. One of Jesus' pithy little sayings after he comes back after his resurrection in the Gospel of John is, "Come and have breakfast." And this is one thing that we do well, is eat in the Catholic Studies department. So we have an open house a week from today at this time, noon to 3. Just stop by, get some food, have some conversation, just to get to know you. Our next event for the center is on Thursday, May 29th, and you have that in front of you. Diego Irarrázaval from Chile, who's here with us today. He's here for 6 weeks. Diego spent a couple decades up in the Altiplano in Peru with the Aymara people, and so Diego is an expert on the same sort of thing that Karen was talking about today, which is popular religion, the religion of the common people, and he's going to be talking about wounds and empowerment in South American relational theologies. Healing and empowerment in popular religiosity in Latin America. So please do come for that. And one last thing, if you could also fill out this little evaluation form to let us know what we can do better and what we're doing well so far. Thanks to Karen Kraft and Francis Salino for doing all the logistics today. And one final hand for Karen and Scott for working.